The German sentry squinted through the pre-dawn darkness from his concrete bunker. It was June 6, 1944, and the weather was miserable. Rain had lashed the coast for days. No invasion force would dare cross in such conditions. Then he saw them. Through the mist, shapes materialized. Hundreds of them. Thousands. The largest armada ever assembled in human history, stretching from horizon to horizon. 5,000 ships bearing the weight of democracy against tyranny. The sentry reached for the telephone with trembling hands, knowing in that instant that Hitler's greatest fortification, the Atlantic Wall, had just become a tomb. This is the story of how the most ambitious defensive system ever constructed failed, not through weakness, but through deception. Not through lack of preparation, but through misdirection so brilliant it rewrote the rules of warfare. This is the story of D-Day, where planning defeated concrete, innovation conquered fear, and an army crossed the sea to change the world. Adolf Hitler stood on the cliffs of Cap Grisnez in the autumn of 1940, staring across 21 miles of gray water toward England. Operation Sea Lion, his planned invasion of Britain, had faltered. The Luftwaffe had failed to secure air superiority. The Royal Navy still ruled the waves. Britain, bloodied but unbroken, remained defiant. If he couldn't invade Britain, Hitler reasoned, then Britain would eventually try to invade him. The thought gnawed at the Führer's mind as he gazed at those white cliffs. Somewhere across that channel, Winston Churchill was already plotting. The Prime Minister had made no secret of his intentions. Britain would return to Europe. The only questions were when and where. Hitler turned to his architects and engineers with a vision that bordered on megalomaniacal. He would build a wall. Not just any wall, but a fortress chain spanning 2,000 miles of European coastline. From the frozen fjords of Norway to the sun-baked beaches of Spain, concrete and steel would create an impenetrable barrier. Fortress Europa would be born. "I am the greatest builder of fortifications of all time," Hitler declared, with the characteristic humility that had served him so well. Construction began in earnest during the winter of 1941. The task was staggering. Organization Todt, named after its founder Fritz Todt, mobilized hundreds of thousands of workers. Forced laborers from occupied nations poured concrete under the watchful eyes of German overseers. The Atlantic Wall consumed resources on a scale that defied imagination. 13 million cubic yards of concrete, 1.5 million tons of steel. Gun emplacements sprouted along the coastline like concrete mushrooms. Each was designed to cover its neighbors with interlocking fields of fire. The larger positions housed artillery pieces capable of engaging targets miles out to sea. Railway guns, some with barrels over 80 feet long, were positioned to rake any invasion fleet with shells the size of automobiles. But concrete and guns were only the beginning. Engineers transformed beaches into killing grounds. They planted thousands upon thousands of obstacles in the tidal zones. Hedgehogs, welded steel beams designed to rip the bottoms from landing craft. Belgian gates, massive steel frameworks topped with mines. Tetrahedrons, pyramid-shaped concrete blocks that could tear a hole in a ship's hull. Each obstacle was precisely positioned to catch landing craft at different stages of the tide. The beaches themselves became minefields. Teller mines capable of destroying a tank were buried in the sand. S-mines, nicknamed Bouncing Betties by the Allies, were designed to spring upward when triggered, detonating at waist height with devastating effect. Barbed wire coiled across approaches like metal thorns. Behind the beaches, engineers flooded low-lying fields to create impassable swamps. They drove thick wooden poles into potential glider landing zones, turning them into deadly obstacle courses. They fortified villages and farmhouses, transforming peaceful Norman countryside into urban battlegrounds. Yet even as the wall grew, cracks appeared in its foundation. not in the concrete, but in the minds of those tasked with defending it. The raid on Dieppe in August 1942 taught both sides lessons written in blood and fire. When the Canadian and British commandos stormed the French port, they walked into a meat grinder. German defenders, secure in their fortifications, massacred the attackers on the beaches. Of the 5,000 who landed, more than half became casualties. Tanks bogged down in the shingle. Men drowned in their own blood. The raid was a catastrophe. For the Germans, Dieppe seemed very positive for them. The Atlantic Wall worked. Direct assaults on fortified ports were suicide. Hitler ordered construction intensified, more concrete, more guns, more obstacles. But the Allies learned different lessons. Never attack a defended port directly. The note was written in red ink across every planning document that followed. If ports were death traps, then bring your own harbor. The seeds of the Mulberry harbors were planted in the corpses on Dieppe's beaches. And there was another lesson, one that would echo through the planning of D-Day. Specialized equipment could make the difference between success and slaughter. The failure of tanks on Dieppe's shingle would lead to the development of Hobart's Funnies, the strange armored vehicles that would help win the beaches of Normandy. By 1943, the Atlantic Wall had grown into the largest construction project in military history. Hitler spoke of it constantly, pointing to models and maps, assuring his generals that no invasion could breach his fortifications. But the wall had a fatal flaw. It couldn't be everywhere at once.
Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the aristocratic Prussian who commanded all German forces in the West, faced an impossible equation. He had 60 divisions to defend 2,000 miles of coastline. Simple mathematics revealed the problem. Spread them evenly, and you had no strength anywhere. Concentrate them, and you left vast stretches undefended. Von Rundstedt proposed a mobile defense. Keep the bulk of the panzer divisions in reserve well inland near Paris. When the invasion came, wherever it came, he would unleash his armored fist and drive the Allies back into the sea before they could establish a foothold. It was classic German doctrine: defense in depth, mobile warfare, concentrated striking power. Then Erwin Rommel arrived. The Desert Fox, fresh from his campaigns in North Africa, inspected the Atlantic Wall in the winter of 1943. What he saw disturbed him profoundly. Many positions were little more than propaganda showpieces, impressive to photograph but inadequate for real combat. Entire sectors lacked proper fortifications. The obstacles on the beaches were incomplete, the minefields were thin. But Rommel's greatest concern wasn't the wall itself, it was Allied air power. He had witnessed firsthand what Allied aircraft could do to moving columns. In North Africa, he'd watched Spitfires and Hurricanes tear apart his supply convoys. He'd seen entire panzer formations pinned down by fighter bombers. The memory haunted him. "The enemy has total air superiority," Rommel told his staff. "Any large-scale movement by day is impossible. The battle must be won on the beaches in the first 24 hours. Any reserves held inland will be destroyed before they reach the coast." It was the strategic divide that would doom the Atlantic Wall before a single Allied soldier set foot on French soil. Rommel demanded the panzer divisions be positioned as close to the likely landing sites as possible. Only then could they counterattack immediately before the Allies dug in. Von Rundstedt insisted on holding them in reserve. Hitler, characteristically, chose the worst possible compromise. He gave von Rundstedt a small mobile reserve, but insisted he personally approve its deployment. The rest would be scattered along the coast according to Rommel's wishes. The result? Neither enough concentration for mobile defense, nor sufficient forward placement for immediate counterattack. The Atlantic Wall's defenders were positioned to fail before the battle even began. There was something else about the Atlantic Wall. Something that Hitler perhaps understood better than his generals. The wall was psychological warfare made concrete. Every bunker broadcast a message: we are prepared, we are waiting, we are invincible. The Allies would have to cross the most dangerous water barrier on Earth, then storm fortifications manned by battle-hardened veterans. The psychological weight of that challenge pressed down on every Allied planner, every soldier preparing to board landing craft. Hitler counted on that weight. He believed the wall would break Allied morale before it broke Allied armies. The mere existence of such fortifications would make invasion unthinkable, or at least delay it until Germany could secure victory in the East. He was wrong. Because while Hitler built walls, the Allies were building something far more dangerous. A plan so audacious, so comprehensive, and so brilliantly deceptive that it would turn the Atlantic Wall's strength into weakness. Winston Churchill had never stopped thinking about returning to Europe. Even during Britain's darkest hours, when German bombs rained on London and invasion seemed imminent, the Prime Minister spoke of the day when British soldiers would march back onto French soil. But Churchill, for all his bulldog determination, understood that passion alone wouldn't breach Hitler's fortress. It would require planning on a scale never before attempted. It would require technology that didn't yet exist. Above all, it would require time. The Americans, when they entered the war in December 1941, brought fresh urgency. General George Marshall and the U.S. Army wanted to invade Europe immediately. 1942 or 1943,
the latest. Churchill counseled patience. Britain had already paid the price for rushing into battle at Dieppe. The next time, they had to get it right. In April 1943, at a conference in Washington, Churchill and President Franklin Roosevelt made it official. Operation Overlord would launch in the summer of 1944. They had just over a year to solve the unsolvable: how to land an army on Hitler's fortress coast and survive long enough to break out. The man given the impossible task was Lieutenant General Frederick Morgan. Morgan was handed a title that sounded more bureaucratic than heroic: Chief of Staff to the Supreme Allied Commander Designate. COSAC for short. He didn't even have a Supreme Commander yet. That position would remain vacant for months. What he did have was a problem that kept him awake at night: where to land. Every mile of the French coast had been photographed, analyzed, studied, until the intelligence officers could draw the beaches from memory. Two locations emerged as realistic options: the Pas-de-Calais and Normandy. The Pas-de-Calais was the obvious choice. Just 21 miles from the English coast at the Dover Strait, it offered the shortest sea crossing. Allied air cover would be strongest there. The route to Germany would be most direct. Every logic chart, every analysis, pointed to Calais. Which meant, Morgan realized, it was the wrong choice. The Germans expected Calais. Their best troops defended it. Their heaviest fortifications lined its approaches. The Atlantic Wall was strongest where the channel was narrowest. To land at Calais would be to smash headlong into the enemy's prepared defenses, with nowhere to maneuver and no room for surprise. Morgan's staff spread maps across their planning tables. They measured distances, calculated tides, studied beach gradients. Slowly, another option crystallized: Normandy. Normandy offered surprises. 5 beaches spread across 50 miles of coastline, enough space to land multiple divisions simultaneously. The terrain beyond the beaches, while challenging, wasn't impossibly so. Most importantly, the Germans would never expect it. The crossing was longer, the logistics more complex, but that very difficulty might work in the Allies' favor. Surprise, Morgan wrote in his planning documents, will be our greatest weapon. There was just one problem. Normandy had no port. Dieppe had taught the Allies that capturing a fortified port was near suicide. But armies need ports for supplies, for reinforcements, for fuel. An invasion force couldn't survive on what landing craft alone could deliver. Without port facilities, the invasion would wither on the beaches, starved of the material needed to push inland. The solution emerged from the mind of a Churchill advisor. If we can't capture a port, why not bring one with us? It sounded like madness. Build an entire harbor in England, sail it across the Channel, and assemble it on the French coast? The engineering challenges were staggering, but the alternatives were worse. British engineers began designing what would be called the Mulberry harbors, artificial ports that could be towed across the Channel and installed off the Normandy coast. The basic concept was elegant. Create a breakwater using massive concrete caissons called Phoenix units, each the size of a 5-story building. Sink them in a line parallel to the shore, creating a protected anchorage. Within that shelter, floating piers called whales would rise and fall with the tide, allowing vehicles to drive directly from ships onto French soil. The caissons alone required more concrete than the entire pre-war British construction industry produced in a month. Shipyards across Britain began building the Phoenix units in secret. To casual observers, they looked like strange floating dry docks, or perhaps barges. No one guessed they were pieces of prefabricated harbors. But harbors weren't the only infrastructure problem. Armies run on fuel, and the quantities needed were astronomical. How do you deliver millions of gallons of gasoline across the Channel to keep tanks rolling toward Germany? The answer came in the form of PLUTO, pipeline under the ocean. Engineers designed a pipeline that would be unreeled from giant drums onto the Channel floor, stretching 100 miles from the Isle of Wight to the Normandy coast. Pumping stations disguised as innocent buildings, one famously camouflaged as an ice cream parlor, would push fuel across the Channel at thousands of gallons per hour. When senior officers first heard these proposals, many thought someone was joking. Artificial harbors? Underwater pipelines? What would they propose next? Inflatable tanks? Actually, yes, that was exactly what they proposed. Major General Percy Hobart was the kind of officer that conventional commanders nervous. A pioneer of armored warfare, he'd been forced into retirement before the war for his unconventional ideas. Churchill personally brought him back, gave him a division to train, and set him loose on the problem of getting tanks off Normandy's beaches. The challenge was brutal in its simplicity. Beaches are terrible places for tanks. Shingle and soft sand bog down treads. Seawalls block passage. Minefields destroy armor. Machine gun fire slaughters exposed infantry. How do you get armor inland fast enough to support the troops before German counterattacks wipe out the beachhead? Hobart's solution was to stop thinking of tanks as simply mobile guns. What if they became mobile engineering tools? His team produced a menagerie of specialized vehicles so strange that soldiers christened them Hobart's Funnies. But there was nothing funny about their effectiveness. The Sherman DD tank could swim. A collapsible canvas screen gave it buoyancy, while propellers drove it through water. It looked ridiculous, like a tank wearing a skirt, but it could land with the first wave of infantry, providing immediate fire support.
The Sherman Crab mounted a rotating drum in front, fitted with heavy chains. As the drum spun, the chains flailed the ground, detonating mines. It could clear a safe path through minefields at walking speed while under fire. The Churchill AVRE, Armored Vehicle Royal Engineers, carried a petard mortar that fired 40-pound explosive charges. It could demolish concrete bunkers, blow gaps in seawalls, or destroy fortified buildings. When a pillbox needed to be eliminated, an AVRE would drive up, aim its petard practically point blank, and reduce the position to rubble. For crossing ditches and craters, Hobart created the Fascine Carrier, a tank carrying an enormous bundle of wooden poles that could be dropped into gaps, creating an instant bridge. For climbing seawalls, there was the Churchill ARK, Armored Ramp Carrier, which would position itself against the wall and extend ramps, turning itself into a bridge for following vehicles.
For laying temporary roads across soft sand or shingle, the bobbin tank carried massive rolls of reinforced matting that it could unroll behind it, creating firm tracks. Each device solved a specific problem identified through painful experience and careful analysis. Together, they would help turn the carnage of Dieppe into the success of D-Day. But even the best equipment would fail if the Germans were waiting in strength at the right place. That's where the most audacious part of the plan came in. Convince Hitler that the invasion would come at the Pas de Calais, not Normandy. The name came from Churchill himself, quoting Stalin, "In wartime, truth is so precious that she should always be attended by a bodyguard of lies." Operation Bodyguard was that bodyguard, not a single deception, but a web of interlocking lies so comprehensive that it would take an entire book to catalog them all. The goal was simple to state, breathtakingly difficult to execute. Convince Hitler that the invasion would come at the Pas de Calais, not Normandy. The plan's brilliance lay in its understanding of human psychology. The Allies wouldn't try to hide invasion preparations. That was impossible. Instead, they would conduct their preparations openly, but point them at the wrong target. Let Hitler see the buildup. Let him count the troops and tanks. Just make sure he's looking at the wrong place when the real blow falls. The deception campaign began with German spies in Britain. Or rather, with the spies the Germans thought they had in Britain. Unknown to Hitler's intelligence services, every single German agent in Britain had been captured, killed, or turned. The 20 Committee, XX being a double cross, now controlled Germany's entire spy network in Britain. Every report sent to Berlin, every radio message, every piece of intelligence was carefully crafted by British handlers. These double agents became the foundation of the deception. They reported what the Allies wanted reported, a massive army group forming in Kent and Sussex, directly across from the Pas de Calais. Training exercises, equipment stockpiles, troop movements, all pointing toward an invasion at the Channel's narrowest point. The reports had to be believable. Occasionally, the double agents reported accurate information about less sensitive operations, building their credibility. German intelligence officers, comparing multiple agent reports that corroborated each other, never suspected they were all singing from the same scripted songbook. But human intelligence alone wouldn't convince the Germans. They had reconnaissance aircraft, radar, photo analysis. The deception had to work on multiple levels. In southeastern England, the 1st United States Army Group, FUSAG, began to assemble. On paper, it was a massive formation, 12 divisions, over 100,000 troops, supported by hundreds of tanks and thousands of vehicles. German reconnaissance flights photographed its encampments and vehicle parks. There was only one problem. FUSAG didn't exist. What the Germans photographed was the greatest theatrical production in military history. The tanks were inflatable rubber, positioned to cast realistic shadows. The aircraft were plywood and canvas, painted to look authentic from the air. The landing craft filling harbors along the Kent coast were constructed from scaffolding and canvas, floating dummies that bobbed convincingly in the water. Radio operators maintained constant traffic, mimicking the communications of a real army group. Fake equipment orders were placed through channels the Germans were known to monitor. Supply convoys moved between genuine rear area depots and FUSAG positions, except the trucks drove to the camps full and left empty, the same supplies being recycled in an endless loop. The military police directing traffic wore FUSAG shoulder patches. Local pubs near the camps filled with soldiers wearing the unit insignia. British intelligence even ensured that laundry contracts for FUSAG units were leaked to German agents, showing thousands of uniforms being cleaned weekly. And commanding this ghost army? General George Patton. George S. Patton Jr. was the perfect choice for deception commander, and he hated every minute of it. The Germans rated Patton as the Allies' most dangerous general. His slashing attack through Sicily had impressed German intelligence, which considered him the obvious choice to lead any invasion of Europe. By placing Patton at FUSAG's head, the Allies gave the Ghost Army credibility no amount of inflatable tanks could provide. For Patton, it was torture. Here was a fighting general, one of the most aggressive commanders in the U.S. Army, commanding an army of rubber and plywood. While the real invasion preparations continued further west, Patton had to content himself with visiting fake encampments and being photographed in Kent, where German agents could report his presence. He threw himself into the role with grudging dedication. Patton made public appearances, gave speeches to his troops, carefully selected audiences of real soldiers, and ensured he was seen at locations that would confirm FUSAG's existence. German reconnaissance photographed his personal aircraft at airfields near FUSAG headquarters. His distinctive command vehicle, with its array of radio antennas, was spotted throughout southeastern England. The operation's cynical brilliance lay in exploiting Patton's earlier disgrace. After slapping shell-shocked soldiers in Sicily, he'd been removed from combat command. To the Germans, his assignment to FUSAG made perfect sense, a talented general being given one more chance to redeem himself with the most important operation of the war. They never suspected that assignment itself was the operation. While German agents reported from the ground and Patton commanded his Phantom Army, the Allied air forces conducted their own deception. For every bomb dropped on Normandy's Atlantic Wall positions, 2 fell on the Pas de Calais. The ratio was carefully calculated. Hit Normandy too lightly, and the actual invasion would face intact defenses. Hit it too heavily, and the Germans would guess the real target. The aerial campaign had to suggest Normandy was receiving attention as a possible diversionary target, while Calais bore the brunt as the obvious main objective. Allied fighter sweeps followed the same pattern. Photo reconnaissance flights over Calais were flown more frequently than over Normandy, in ratios German intelligence could detect and analyze. Rail yards and bridges near Calais were systematically destroyed, exactly what an attacker would do before an invasion. German analysts, studying bomb damage reports and flight patterns, saw what they expected to see: preparation for an assault on the Pas de Calais, with secondary attacks possible at other locations to split German defenses. The French resistance played a crucial role in the deception, though most resistants never knew they were part of Operation Bodyguard. Allied intelligence tasked resistance networks with gathering information about German defenses. The requests themselves served as indicators of Allied interest. Resistance groups near Calais received far more tasking than those in Normandy, conducting more sabotage operations, gathering more intelligence, and generally operating at a higher tempo. German counterintelligence, monitoring resistance activities, noted the pattern. Clearly, the Allies were most interested in Calais. Why else would resistance operations be concentrated there? The tragic irony was that increased resistance activity in the Calais region led to increased German anti-partisan operations, resulting in casualties among French fighters who never knew their missions were designed to mislead the enemy rather than directly support the invasion. Perhaps the most delicate aspect of Operation Bodyguard was timing. The deception had to hold until after the Normandy landing succeeded. Even then, it had to persist, convincing Hitler that Normandy was merely a feint, a diversion before the real invasion at Calais. Allied planners knew that getting ashore was only half the battle. The crucial period would be the first few days, when the beachhead was most vulnerable. If Hitler immediately recognized Normandy as the main effort and rushed all his reserves there, the invasion could still fail. The solution was to layer the deception in time. Before D-Day, convince them Calais is the target. During the initial landings, let them believe Normandy might be real. After establishing the beachhead, reinforce the notion that Normandy is a diversion, the real blow still to come. Double agents would report that Patton's FUSAG remained in southeastern England, ready to launch the decisive assault. That assault, they suggested, would come soon after the Normandy landings, once German reserves had been committed to defending the feint. It was psychological warfare at its most sophisticated. The Germans would be paralyzed, unable to commit fully to either sector, terrified of moving troops from Calais only to have the main invasion land there after all.
As D-Day approached, even more deception layers were added. In Scotland, fake radio traffic suggested an entire army preparing to invade Norway, tying down German divisions in Scandinavia. In the Mediterranean, false intelligence suggested operations planned against southern France or the Balkans, preventing transfers of German troops from those theaters to France. The night before D-Day, RAF bombers dropped clouds of metallic chaff over the Pas de Calais, creating radar returns that mimicked a massive invasion fleet heading for those beaches. German radar operators watched the ghost fleet approach, while the real armada sailed toward Normandy under radio silence. Diversionary operations kept German attention scattered. Commando raids hit beaches far from the real landing sites. Resistance cells across France launched coordinated attacks on rail lines and communications, making it impossible for German intelligence to determine which operations were meaningful and which were noise. By June 5, 1944, the deception was complete. The Allies had created a fictional reality so detailed, so consistent across every intelligence source, the German High Command accepted it as truth. Hitler would not commit his reserves to Normandy for weeks after the landing, convinced the real invasion was still to come. Operation Bodyguard had succeeded beyond its architect's wildest hopes. The grandest deception in military history was about to pay dividends measured in lives saved and ground gained. But first, someone had to actually cross the channel and storm the beaches. They came from every corner of the Allied world. American farm boys who'd never seen an ocean before boarding troop ships in New York. British factory workers from Birmingham and Manchester, their hands still calloused from making munitions. Canadian lumberjacks, Australian sheep herders, Polish exiles, French volunteers, and soldiers from a dozen other nations, united by a common cause. By May 1944, over 2 million troops were concentrated in southern England. The British Isles had become one vast military camp. Villages hosted regiments, country estates served as headquarters, fields that once grew wheat now parked tanks. Britain had become a coiled spring, ready to release years of pent-up force across the Channel. The soldiers training for D-Day knew this operation was different. The security, the scale, the endless rehearsals, everything telegraphed that this was the big one. They didn't know exactly where or when, but they knew that soon they'd be testing themselves against Hitler's Atlantic Wall. Training was brutal and realistic. At Slapton Sands in Devon, beaches that resembled Normandy's coast became proving grounds. Troops practiced amphibious landings under live fire. Some exercises went catastrophically wrong. In April, German E-boats stumbled upon a landing rehearsal and torpedoed several LSTs, killing over 700 men. The disaster was classified top secret. Survivors were sworn to silence. The invasion couldn't be compromised even for the dead. General Dwight D. Eisenhower carried the burden of command with a smile that often looked forced. As Supreme Allied Commander, he would give the order that would send hundreds of thousands of young men into battle. Some wouldn't come home. That weight pressed down on him every waking moment. Eisenhower was the perfect choice for coalition warfare. Diplomatic, patient,
able to smooth the friction between strong-willed commanders from different nations. But diplomacy wouldn't stop German bullets. The decision to go, the responsibility for success or catastrophic failure, rested solely on his shoulders. His subordinate commanders were a gallery of personalities. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery would command the initial assault forces. Monty was brilliant, meticulous, and insufferably arrogant. American officers despised him. British troops loved him. Eisenhower needed his tactical genius while managing his ego. General Omar Bradley would lead the American forces. Methodical, thoughtful, the soldier's general who planned carefully and hated wasting lives. He would command at Omaha Beach, where his worst fears would nearly come true. Air Chief Marshal Trafford Leigh-Mallory controlled Allied air forces. He had argued against using paratroopers, predicting catastrophic casualties when they dropped behind German lines. Eisenhower overruled him, but the air marshal's grim predictions haunted planning sessions. Admiral Bertram Ramsay commanded the naval forces, the massive armada that would carry the invasion across the Channel. His was perhaps the most complex task: coordinate 5,000 ships, land troops on 5 beaches simultaneously, maintain supply lines, and do it all under the nose of German coastal artillery. Each commander had his role, his forces, his fears, but only Eisenhower could decide when to launch the greatest gamble in military history. As May turned to June, meteorologists became the most important people in England. The invasion required specific conditions: spring tides for landing craft to reach the beaches, a full moon for paratroopers, reasonable weather for air support, and seas calm enough that seasick troops could fight when they hit shore. Those conditions all aligned on just a few days each month. The first window was June 5th to 7th. After that, they'd have to wait 2 more weeks for the next favorable tides. Captain James Stagg, a Scotsman who headed the Allied meteorological team, monitored weather patterns with growing concern. A low-pressure system was building over the Atlantic. If it reached the Channel on June 5th, the invasion would face storms and high seas, conditions that could doom the invasion before it began. On June 3rd, Eisenhower met with his commanders. Stagg delivered bad news. The weather was deteriorating. June 5th would bring strong winds, low clouds, and rough seas, conditions that could doom the invasion before it began. Eisenhower made the hardest decision of his career: postpone. The Armada was already loading. Thousands of troops had been briefed on their objectives. They knew the target, the timing, everything. Security protocols dictated they be held incommunicado once briefed. But how do you hold 100,000 men isolated for an indefinite delay? Every day increased the risk of leaks, of security breaches, of the Germans discovering what was coming.
Worse, the troops were psychologically prepared. They'd said their goodbyes, written their final letters home, made peace with the possibility of death. Postponement meant facing that psychological preparation all over again. The troops boarded their landing ships on June 4th in driving rain. The Channel was rough, gray water topped with whitecaps. Destroyers pitched in the swell. Landing craft knocked against their motherships. Below decks, men faced the uniquely miserable combination of fear and seasickness. Then word came. The operation was postponed. The relief was physical, but so was the letdown. The psychological wind-up had to be sustained, the fear held in check for another day. That evening, Eisenhower met again with Stagg and his commanders. The meteorologist offered a glimmer of hope. The storm would pass quickly. Behind it, a brief break in the weather. 36 hours, maybe less, of acceptable conditions starting the morning of June 6th. It was a gamble. The window was narrow. If Stagg was wrong, if the weather didn't clear, troops would land blind, with no air support, in rough seas, facing intact German defenses. But if they waited for the next tide window, 2 more weeks of delay meant 2 more weeks the Germans could discover the plan. The commanders debated.
Montgomery was characteristically confident. Mallory worried about aircraft in marginal conditions. Ramsey could manage rough seas, but his landing craft crews would struggle. Finally, Eisenhower spoke. "Okay, let's go." 3 words, 6 syllables. They committed hundreds of thousands of men to battle, launched the largest amphibious invasion in history, and began the liberation of Western Europe. But those 3 words almost didn't matter, because in France, the Germans had stopped paying attention. The irony was almost poetic. Hitler had built the greatest fortification in history, positioned troops across 2,000 miles of coastline, and established elaborate warning systems. Then, on the one night when it mattered most, German vigilance collapsed. The storm that forced Eisenhower to postpone convinced German commanders that no invasion was imminent. Who would attempt a channel crossing in such weather? Defensive units stood down from high alert. Officers returned to normal schedules. Rommel, who had been working frantically to strengthen Normandy's defenses, took advantage of the bad weather to return to Germany. His wife's birthday was June 6th. He would celebrate with her, present her with shoes he'd purchased in Paris, and then meet with Hitler to request additional panzer divisions for the Atlantic Wall. At headquarters in Berchtesgaden, Hitler kept his usual schedule. He'd spent the evening watching films and entertaining his inner circle. As dawn approached on June 6th, the Führer was asleep, his staff under strict orders not to wake him for anything short of an emergency. At the coastal positions, German sentries stared into fog and rain. Some dozed, others played cards in their bunkers. A few kept watch but saw nothing alarming. Radar stations picked up confusing returns. Metallic chaff dropped by British bombers created ghost images on scopes. Controllers assumed it was another air raid heading for inland targets. The Atlantic Wall had been built for this moment, but the men who would defend it were unprepared for what was coming out of the darkness. The first men to hit French soil weren't infantry from landing craft. They fell from the sky. At 12 minutes past midnight, 6 British Horsa gliders released from their towing aircraft at 6,000 feet over eastern Normandy. Inside each glider, 28 men of the Oxfordshire and Buckinghamshire Light Infantry held their breath as the pilots banked toward their targets, 2 bridges over the Caen Canal and Orne River. The gliders descended in silence, ghosts sailing through the night. German sentries never heard them. At 0016, the first glider hit ground, skidding to a stop just 50 yards from the Caen Canal Bridge. Troops poured out, running across the bridge before the startled German defenders could react. By 0021, both bridges were in British hands. The first objectives of D-Day had been secured in less than 10 minutes. 50 miles west, American C-47 transport aircraft carrying the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions approached their drop zones around the town of Sainte-Marie-Église. The sky filled with anti-aircraft fire as German defenders finally realized something was happening. The transports banked and weaved, pilots fighting to maintain formation while tracers streaked past their wings. The jump light turned green. 16,000 American paratroopers leapt into darkness over occupied France. It was chaos. The pilots, evading flak, scattered across the countryside. Troopers landed miles from their drop zones. Some came down in flooded fields Rommel had ordered created specifically to drown paratroopers. Weighted down with equipment, men drowned in 4 feet of water. Others landed in towns, dangling from trees and church steeples while German soldiers shot at them. Private John Steele of the 505th Paratrooper Infantry Regiment caught on the church steeple at Sainte-Marie-Église and hung there for 2 hours, playing dead while Germans fought American paratroopers in the square below. He would survive to tell the tale, but scores of his comrades died in the darkness, scattered and alone. Yet even scattered chaos had purpose. The dispersed drops actually helped the invasion. German defenders couldn't determine where the main airborne effort was. Reports came in from every direction. Paratroopers north of Carentan, south of Valognes, in the flooded marshes, in the bocage country. German commanders trying to make sense of the reports couldn't form a coherent picture. By 0300, groups of American paratroopers had coalesced around officers and sergeants. The distinctive cricket clickers they carried helped identify friend from foe in the darkness. One click challenged, two clicks answered. Slowly, unit by unit, the American airborne began accomplishing its objectives. Securing causeway exits from Utah Beach, destroying bridges to prevent German reinforcements, and creating havoc behind the Atlantic Wall. As dawn approached, German coastal watchers finally saw what had been sailing toward them through the night. The fog began to lift, revealing a sight no defender ever wanted to see. 5,000 ships stretched across the horizon. Battleships, cruisers, destroyers, transports, and landing craft of every description. It was as if every vessel in the world had converged on this one stretch of coastline. German battery commanders frantically telephoned headquarters. "The invasion is here. Normandy, thousands of ships." At 0300, the German naval guns opened fire. Shells arced toward the Allied fleet, throwing up massive waterspouts as they landed. But Allied warships replied instantly. The naval bombardment that followed was unlike anything in the history of warfare. Battleships like HMS Warspite and USS Nevada, veterans of previous wars, unleashed their big guns. 15-inch shells crashed into concrete bunkers, reducing fortifications to rubble. Cruisers and destroyers added their fire, creating a rolling thunder that could be heard in England. The Atlantic Wall, Hitler's fortress of concrete and steel, was being systematically dismantled by naval gunfire. Bunkers collapsed, gun emplacements shattered, communication lines severed. The defenders, cowering in their fortifications, could only endure the bombardment and pray for it to end. Then, at 0600, Allied aircraft joined the barrage. 1,600 heavy bombers swept over the invasion beaches, dropping thousands of tons of explosives on German positions. The beach defenses vanished in smoke and flame. But the bombardment, for all its ferocity, had limited effect. Many bunkers were too heavily reinforced. Bombs fell behind the beaches, missing the forward positions. And in some sectors, particularly at Omaha Beach, the Germans had positioned their defenses in locations that were difficult to target from sea or air. As the guns fell silent, the first wave of landing craft headed for shore. Coxswains struggled to hold their landing craft steady as waves rolled under them. In the holds, infantrymen gripped their rifles and tried not to vomit. The smell of diesel fuel, seawater, and vomit was overwhelming. Most men had been awake for 24 hours. Many were drenched and freezing. All were terrified. The landing craft neared the beaches. Through the gray dawn light, the men glimpsed their destinations. Sand, obstacles, smoke, the distant crash of explosions. Everything looked unfamiliar, alien, deadly. At the western end of the invasion, the U.S. 4th Infantry Division approached Utah Beach. The naval bombardment had been fierce here, and the German defenses looked battered. But as the landing craft closed on shore, a strong current pushed them south, away from their designated landing zone. The Assistant Division Commander, Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt, Jr., son of President Theodore Roosevelt, landed with the first wave. At 56, he was the oldest man and the only general in the first assault. Despite a heart condition that should have kept him off the battlefield, Roosevelt had insisted on leading his men. Looking around the beach, Roosevelt realized immediately they were in the wrong place, more than a mile south of their objective. The wrong beach. None of the landmarks matched the maps. In any normal operation, this would be a disaster. Roosevelt made a snap decision that would save thousands of lives. "We'll start the war from right here."
The beach they'd landed on, while unplanned, turned out to be less heavily defended than their intended target. The current had accidentally delivered them to the weakest point in Utah's defenses. Within hours, the 4th Division was moving inland with lighter casualties than anyone had dared hope.
By mid-morning, they linked up with the paratroopers of the 101st Airborne who had secured the causeway exits. Utah Beach was a success, bought partly through careful planning and partly through pure accident. 15 miles east, the men of the U.S. 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions faced a very different situation at Omaha Beach. Omaha was a defender's dream, a crescent of sand overlooked by 100-foot bluffs. The German 352nd Infantry Division, battle-hardened veterans brought in just weeks before, occupied fortified positions with interlocking fields of fire. They had survived the naval bombardment in deep bunkers. Now they waited. The first wave of landing craft hit at 0630. Ramps dropped, men rushed into chest-deep water. German machine guns opened fire. It was slaughter. The amphibious D.D. Sherman tanks, which should have provided fire support, mostly sank in the rough seas. Of 29 tanks launched, only 2 reached shore. The infantry went in alone. Men fell before they reached the sand. Bodies piled in the surf. The lucky ones made it to the beach and threw themselves behind the shingle embankment, but they were pinned there, unable to advance. Any movement brought instant machine gun fire from the bluffs. The beach became a hellscape. Burning landing craft, dead men floating in the surf, wounded crying for medics who couldn't reach them, equipment strewn everywhere, and overhead the constant crack of German rifles and machine guns. Company A of the 116th Regiment, 35 men landing directly in front of the strongest German position, was annihilated in minutes. Only 6 survived the first hour. Other companies fared little better. By 0800, 30% of the assault force was casualties. On the command ship offshore, General Omar Bradley monitored the radio traffic with growing horror. Omaha was failing. He considered evacuating the beach and landing follow-up forces elsewhere. The entire invasion plan hung in the balance. But on the beach, individual acts of courage were turning the tide. Destroyers, seeing the crisis, moved dangerously close to shore, close enough to ground themselves, and began firing directly at German positions at point-blank range. Naval shells smashed bunkers that had survived the earlier bombardment. Colonel George Taylor of the 16th Infantry Regiment, crouching behind the shingle embankment, shouted what became Omaha's unofficial motto: "Two kinds of people are staying on this beach, the dead and those who are going to die. Now let's get the hell out of here." Small groups of men, led by junior officers and sergeants, began moving. Bangalore torpedoes blasted gaps in barbed wire. Engineers cleared paths through minefields. Men crawled forward, covering each other, taking casualties but gaining yards. By mid-morning, American troops reached the base of the bluffs. They began climbing, using whatever handholds they could find. German defenders firing down from above took a terrible toll, but the Americans kept coming. Company A of the 2nd Ranger Battalion found a path up the bluff between 2 strong points. They made it to the top and began attacking German positions from the flank. Other units followed. By noon, the Americans held several positions on the high ground. Omaha Beach would not be fully secured until evening. The cost was staggering, over 2,000 casualties, more than all other beaches combined. But they had held. The Atlantic Wall was breached. East of Omaha, the British and Canadian forces faced their own challenges on Gold, Juno, and Sword beaches. At Gold Beach, the British 50th Infantry Division landed at 7:25. The tides were higher here, reducing the beach obstacle's effectiveness. More critically, the British deployed their specialized armor, Hobart's Funnies. The crab flail tanks went first, their chains detonating mines and clearing paths. ARV tanks followed, demolishing concrete obstacles with their petard mortars. The British infantry advanced behind this moving shield, taking far lighter casualties than their American counterparts at Omaha. German resistance was fierce but localized. The defenders fought from bunkers and fortified houses, but British infantry, supported by specialized armor, systematically reduced each position. By mid-noon, the 50th Division was several miles inland. At Juno Beach, the Canadian 3rd Infantry Division faced rougher conditions. The landing was delayed by 30 minutes due to rough seas, which meant the tide was higher, bringing the landing craft closer to underwater obstacles. Several craft struck mines and sank. Others grounded on obstacles, forcing troops to wade through deep water under fire.
The Canadians took heavy casualties in the first hour, but Hobart's Funnies again proved their worth. Once the specialized armor got ashore and began clearing paths, Canadian infantry pushed inland rapidly. The town of Courcelles fell by mid-morning. Canadian troops pressed further inland than any other assault force on D-Day. Sword Beach, the easternmost landing, saw the British 3rd Infantry Division come ashore at 0725. Resistance was moderate. The naval bombardment had been particularly effective here. More importantly, the British benefited from being last in line. German defenders, already engaged with forces at the other beaches, couldn't concentrate their fire. The British objective was ambitious: capture the city of Caen by nightfall. It was a bridge too far. German armored units were moving toward the beach, and British infantry, still sorting themselves out after the landing, lacked the strength to push so deep so fast. But by early afternoon, British commandos from Sword Beach linked up with the airborne troops holding the Orne River bridges. The eastern flank was secured. As Allied troops fought to expand their beachheads, German commanders struggled to respond. The response was hampered by confusion, indecision, and Hitler's sleeping schedule. The first reports of paratrooper drops were dismissed as raids. When the naval bombardment began, local commanders still believed it might be a diversion. Only when landing craft hit the beaches did German headquarters realize this was the invasion. But which invasion? The one they'd been expecting at Pas-de-Calais, or a feint before the main blow? The Allies' deception plan was working perfectly. German commanders hedged their bets, unwilling to commit fully to Normandy in case it was a diversion. Field Marshal von Rundstedt, the overall commander in the West, wanted to unleash his panzer reserves immediately. But Hitler controlled those divisions, and Hitler was asleep. Von Rundstedt's chief of staff telephoned Hitler's headquarters repeatedly, trying to get authorization to move the tanks. The staff officers at Berchtesgaden refused to wake the Führer. Hours slipped away. Every hour the panzers sat idle was an hour the Allies used to strengthen their hold on the beaches. When Hitler finally woke at mid-morning and learned of the invasion, he still wasn't convinced. Normandy was a feint, he insisted. The real invasion would come at Calais. Keep the reserves in place. It was early afternoon before Hitler authorized the panzer divisions to move toward Normandy. By then, Allied fighters and bombers controlled the skies. The German tanks trying to advance to the battlefield were savaged by air attack. Entire columns were destroyed. Units that should have reached Normandy by nightfall wouldn't arrive for days. Rommel, celebrating his wife's birthday in Germany, learned of the invasion mid-morning. He immediately departed for France, but it would be evening before he reached his headquarters. The Desert Fox had been absent during the most critical hours of the battle. As darkness fell on June 6th, the situation was precarious but hopeful. The Allies had landed 156,000 troops on Normandy's beaches. The cost was heavy, roughly 10,000 casualties, including 4,000 dead. But they had achieved their objective. 5 beachheads, all holding, all expanding. The beaches were chaotic. Supply dumps sprawled across the sand. Wrecked landing craft littered the shoreline. Wounded awaited evacuation. But reinforcements were coming ashore, vehicles were moving inland, and artillery was being positioned. The Atlantic Wall had been breached. Hitler's fortress of concrete had failed its first real test. Not because the fortifications were weak. Many bunkers remained intact and dangerous. Not because the defenders lacked courage. German troops fought tenaciously. The wall failed because the Allies had learned from Dieppe, had innovated, had planned meticulously, and had deceived brilliantly. But D-Day was only the beginning. Now came the hard part, breaking out of the beachhead and driving into France. The Germans, recovering from their initial shock, would counterattack with everything they had. The battle for Normandy was just beginning. The first week after D-Day was a race between Allied buildup and German counterattack. Whoever got stronger faster would control the battle. The Mulberry harbors proved their worth immediately. The two artificial ports, one in the American sector at Omaha, one in the British sector at Arromanches, began receiving ships on June 9th. Trucks drove directly from cargo vessels onto French soil. Supplies flowed at rates that astonished even the planners. Then, on June 19th, the worst storm in 40 years hit the channel. Gale-force winds destroyed the American Mulberry at Omaha completely. The British harbor at Arromanches survived but was badly damaged. For 4 days, virtually no supplies reached the beaches. The storm was arguably the Germans' best ally. Allied forces, suddenly starved of ammunition and fuel, couldn't exploit their advantages. German reinforcements used the respite to dig in. But the PLUTO pipeline helped compensate. Fuel flowed through the underwater line, keeping tanks supplied even when ships couldn't dock. The ice cream parlor on the Isle of Wight pumped fuel into France at thousands of gallons per hour, a logistical miracle that helped sustain the offensive. Beyond the beaches, the Allies encountered terrain that negated many of their advantages. The Norman bocage, ancient agricultural land divided by thick hedgerows, was a defender's paradise. The Canadians took heavy casualties in the first hour, but Hobart's Funnies again proved their worth. Once the specialized armor got ashore and began clearing paths, Canadian infantry pushed inland rapidly. The town of Courcelles fell by mid-morning. Canadian troops pressed further inland than any other assault force on D-Day. Sword Beach, the easternmost landing, saw the British 3rd Infantry Division come ashore at 0725. Resistance was moderate. The naval bombardment had been particularly effective here. More importantly, the British benefited from being last in line. German defenders, already engaged with forces at the other beaches, couldn't concentrate their fire. The British objective was ambitious: capture the city of Caen by nightfall. It was a bridge too far. German armored units were moving toward the beach, and British infantry, still sorting themselves out after the landing, lacked the strength to push so deep so fast. But by early afternoon, British commandos from Sword Beach linked up with the airborne troops holding the Orne River bridges. The eastern flank was secured. As Allied troops fought to expand their beachheads, German commanders struggled to respond. The response was hampered by confusion, indecision, and Hitler's sleeping schedule. The first reports of paratrooper drops were dismissed as raids. When the naval bombardment began, local commanders still believed it might be a diversion. Only when landing craft hit the beaches did German headquarters realize this was the invasion. But which invasion? The one they'd been expecting at Pas-de-Calais, or a feint before the main blow? The Allies' deception plan was working perfectly. German commanders hedged their bets, unwilling to commit fully to Normandy in case it was a diversion. Field Marshal von Rundstedt, the overall commander in the West, wanted to unleash his panzer reserves immediately. But Hitler controlled those divisions, and Hitler was asleep. Von Rundstedt's chief of staff telephoned Hitler's headquarters repeatedly, trying to get authorization to move the tanks. The staff officers at Berchtesgaden refused to wake the Führer. Hours slipped away. Every hour the panzers sat idle was an hour the Allies used to strengthen their hold on the beaches. When Hitler finally woke at mid-morning and learned of the invasion, he still wasn't convinced. Normandy was a feint, he insisted.
The real invasion would come at Calais. Keep the reserves in place. It was early afternoon before Hitler authorized the panzer divisions to move toward Normandy. By then, Allied fighters and bombers controlled the skies. The German tanks trying to advance to the battlefield were savaged by air attack. Entire columns were destroyed. Units that should have reached Normandy by nightfall wouldn't arrive for days. Rommel, celebrating his wife's birthday in Germany, learned of the invasion mid-morning. He immediately departed for France, but it would be evening before he reached his headquarters. The Desert Fox had been absent during the most critical hours of the battle. As darkness fell on June 6th, the situation was precarious but hopeful. The Allies had landed 156,000 troops on Normandy's beaches. The cost was heavy, roughly 10,000 casualties, including 4,000 dead. But they had achieved their objective. 5 beachheads, all holding, all expanding. The beaches were chaotic. Supply dumps sprawled across the sand. Wrecked landing craft littered the shoreline. Wounded awaited evacuation. But reinforcements were coming ashore, vehicles were moving inland, and artillery was being positioned. The Atlantic Wall had been breached. Hitler's fortress of concrete had failed its first real test. Not because the fortifications were weak. Many bunkers remained intact and dangerous. Not because the defenders lacked courage. German troops fought tenaciously. The wall failed because the Allies had learned from Dieppe, had innovated, had planned meticulously, and had deceived brilliantly. But D-Day was only the beginning. Now came the hard part, breaking out of the beachhead and driving into France. The Germans, recovering from their initial shock, would counterattack with everything they had. The battle for Normandy was just beginning. The first week after D-Day was a race between Allied buildup and German counterattack. Whoever got stronger faster would control the battle. The Mulberry harbors proved their worth immediately. The 2 artificial ports, one in the American sector at Omaha, one in the British sector at Arromanches, began receiving ships on June 9th. Trucks drove directly from cargo vessels onto French soil. Supplies flowed at rates that astonished even the planners. Then, on June 19th, the worst storm in 40 years hit the channel. Gale-force winds destroyed the American Mulberry at Omaha completely. The British harbor at Arromanches survived but was badly damaged. For 4 days, virtually no supplies reached the beaches. The storm was arguably the Germans' best ally. Allied forces, suddenly starved of ammunition and fuel, couldn't exploit their advantages. German reinforcements used the respite to dig in. But the PLUTO pipeline helped compensate. Fuel flowed through the underwater line, keeping tanks supplied even when ships couldn't dock. The ice cream parlor on the Isle of Wight pumped fuel into France at thousands of gallons per hour, a logistical miracle that helped sustain the offensive. Beyond the beaches, the Allies encountered terrain that negated many of their advantages. The Norman bocage, ancient agricultural land divided by thick hedgerows, was a defender's paradise.
The hedgerows weren't decorative bushes. They were centuries-old barriers of earth and stone, 6 feet high and 4 feet thick, topped with dense vegetation. Each field became a small fortress, each hedgerow a ready-made defensive line. German troops used the bocage brilliantly. Machine gun teams positioned at hedgerow corners could cover multiple approaches. Tanks hid behind the barriers, invisible until Allied armor pushed through openings. Snipers turned the landscape into a shooting gallery. American Sherman tanks, designed for open warfare, struggled in this close terrain. When they tried to climb over hedgerows, their thin belly armor was exposed, perfect targets for German Panzerfausts. Tank commanders were forced to find gaps where German anti-tank guns waited. Progress measured in fields, not miles.
Companies advanced 100 yards and called it a victory. Battalions spent days capturing single villages. The bocage consumed Allied advantages in numbers and firepower, reducing battles to small unit actions where German defensive skill could shine. Casualties mounted relentlessly. This was attrition warfare at its worst, grinding, exhausting combat that wore down units physically and psychologically. Veterans of the landing talked nostalgically about the beaches, where at least you could see the enemy. In the bocage, death came invisibly from any direction. The British sector centered on capturing Caen, a city of strategic importance, and Montgomery's declared D-Day objective. He'd promised to take it on June 6th. By June 8th, it was still in German hands. By June 15th, it remained German. By month's end, Caen mocked Montgomery's predictions. The problem was German armor. Hitler, finally recognizing Normandy as the main invasion, began feeding panzer divisions into the battle. The 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, 21st Panzer Division, Panzerlehr Division, elite units with Tiger and Panther tanks that outmatched Allied armor, concentrated around Caen. Montgomery launched multiple offensives, Operation Perch, Operation Epsom. Each gained ground but failed to break through. The fighting was savage. Tank battles in Norman villages reduced ancient towns to rubble. Infantry fought house to house in ruins. Casualties on both sides climbed steeply. But Montgomery's failures had strategic value, though few recognized it at the time. By attracting German armor to the British sector, he inadvertently enabled American success in the West. The panzers concentrated around Caen couldn't oppose American forces breaking out toward Cherbourg and beyond. The Americans, meanwhile, pushed toward Cherbourg. The port was vital. The Mulberry harbors, even before the storm, couldn't handle the supply requirements of 2 million men. Cherbourg's deep water facilities could. The advance toward the port took 3 weeks. The German garrison commander, recognizing Cherbourg's value, had orders to hold to the last man, and, failing that, to demolish the port facilities completely. American troops, led by the 7th Corps under General J. Lawton Collins, methodically reduced German strongpoints. The fighting resembled World War I. Artillery bombardments, infantry assaults, grinding advances against prepared positions. But unlike World War I, this advance succeeded. Cherbourg fell on June 27th after fierce streak fighting. But the Germans had done their job well. The port facilities were wrecked. Cranes toppled into the harbor, docks demolished, ships scuttled in the channels. Engineers estimated it would take months to bring Cherbourg back online. Still, the symbolic value was enormous. 3 weeks after D-Day, the Allies held a major port. The beachhead was permanent. There would be no driving them back into the sea. For German troops, the Normandy campaign was a nightmare of attrition. They fought with skill and determination, but 3 factors doomed them. First, Allied air power. Any movement by day brought instant attack. Fighter bombers prowled the skies like predators, pouncing on any vehicle that moved. Supply convoys were destroyed. Reinforcements were decimated before reaching the front. Tank columns were shattered. Second, naval gunfire. German commanders quickly learned that Allied warships could reach targets miles inland. Concentrating troops for counterattacks meant concentrating targets for naval shells. The big guns of battleships and cruisers broke up German attacks before they reached Allied lines.
Third, numbers. For every German soldier, the Allies had 3. For every German tank, the Allies had 5. German units fought until destroyed, were withdrawn, refitted with whatever replacement troops could be scraped together, and thrown back into battle. Allied units fought until depleted, were relieved by fresh troops, rested, reinforced with new soldiers and equipment, and returned at full strength. It was mathematics.
Attrition always favored the side with more resources. Germany was losing in Normandy the same way it was losing in Russia. Ground down by an enemy who could afford losses Germany couldn't replace. By late July, 7 weeks after D-Day, the German defense was brittle. Units existed in name only, commanded by officers leading a fraction of their authorized strength. The line held, but barely. One good push, properly executed, might shatter it completely. The Americans were planning that push. Its code name was Operation Cobra. July 25, 1944, started like every other morning in Normandy, with the thunder of artillery and the chatter of machine guns. But at 09:30, something different began. The bombing had been postponed the previous day by bad weather. Now, under clearer skies, American bombers approached a 4-mile section of the German front line south of the Kootenay Peninsula. The plan was for them to fly parallel to American lines, minimizing the risk of short drops on friendly troops. Most aircraft ignored the plan. 1,800 heavy bombers approached perpendicular to the lines, flying directly over American positions before reaching their targets. Nervous bombardiers seeing ground too similar to their brief targets toggled their releases early. Bombs rained down on American troops. The 30th Infantry Division, positioned as the attack's spearhead, was devastated. Over 100 Americans died, killed by their own bombers. Among the dead was Lieutenant General Leslie McNair, the highest-ranking American officer killed in Europe. Entire companies were shattered. Units that should have led the attack were combat ineffective. But the bombing's main weight fell on German positions. 2,500 tons of high explosives carpeted the German defensive line. Entire units simply ceased to exist. The Panzerlehr Division, an elite armored unit, lost 70% of its combat strength in 30 minutes. Survivors emerged from bunkers in shock, deafened and disoriented. When American infantry advanced at 1100, they initially met strong resistance. The bombings hadn't destroyed every German position. Survivors, though stunned, fought back with the tenacity that characterized German defensive warfare. For a day, it seemed Operation Cobra would stall like every previous offensive. Then the German line collapsed. What looked like strong resistance on July 25th was revealed as a thin crust over nothing. Units that appeared intact were actually fragments commanded by junior officers after senior leaders were killed in the bombing. Communication networks were shattered. Supply lines severed. The defensive line was a facade. On July 26th, American armor pushed through. They encountered scattered resistance, but no coherent defensive line. Where German units attempted stands, American artillery and fighter bombers smashed them. By nightfall, American tanks had advanced 6 miles, more ground than they'd gained in the previous 7 weeks. July 27th saw the advance accelerate. The town of Coutances fell, then Avranches. Suddenly, American forces were breaking into open country. The bocage was behind them. Ahead lay the rolling countryside of central France, terrain perfect for mobile warfare. General Bradley made a fateful decision. Instead of consolidating, press the advantage. Pour troops through the gap before the Germans could close it. Gamble that speed would trump caution. This was the moment George Patton had been waiting for. Released from his command of the Phantom FUSAG, Patton now led a real army. The U.S. Third Army activated August 1st, and the Army had a mission: exploit the breakthrough. Patton was the perfect commander for a pursuit. Aggressive to the point of recklessness, he believed in speed above all else. Keep moving. Keep the enemy off balance. Don't stop for anything. His philosophy matched the situation perfectly. Third Army columns fanned out across Brittany and into central France. Tank units advanced 50 miles a day, then 100. They bypassed German strongpoints, leaving them for follow-up infantry. The goal was depth, not breadth. Drive deep into German-held territory, cut supply lines, spread chaos. The Germans, trying to track Third Army's advance, found their maps couldn't keep up. Units they thought were still at Avranches appeared near Le Mans. Forces they believed were in Brittany materialized in the Loire Valley. Patton's tanks moved faster than German intelligence could process. It was blitzkrieg in reverse. The tactic that Germany had used to conquer France in 1940 now wielded against them. The hunter had become the hunted. Faced with American breakthrough and pursuit, Hitler made his worst tactical decision of the Normandy campaign. Instead of authorizing withdrawal to defensible positions, he ordered a counterattack. The objective was Avranches, the hinge of the American breakout. German panzer divisions would attack westward, cutting off Patton's army from its supply base. Once severed, Third Army would wither and die. The Americans would be driven back. The Atlantic Wall, though breached, would still achieve its purpose. The plan ignored reality. The panzer divisions Hitler ordered into the counterattack were depleted, under strength, and critically short of fuel. They would advance without air cover against an enemy that owned the skies. They would attack into the teeth of American artillery and armor. Operation Lüttich launched on August 7th. 4 panzer divisions, supported by infantry, attacked westward near Mortain. Initially, they achieved surprise. American positions were overrun. The spearheads advanced several miles. Then daylight came, and with it, Allied air power. Fighter bombers appeared in squadron strength, Typhoons with rockets, Thunderbolts with bombs. They fell on the German columns like hawks on rabbits. Tanks burned, fuel trucks exploded. The advance stalled. American reinforcements rushed to Mortain, supported by artillery that fired with devastating accuracy. The German attack, which should have been called off, continued on Hitler's orders. For 3 days, German troops hammered at American lines, taking catastrophic casualties for negligible gains. By August 10th, Operation Lüttich had failed completely. The counterattack hadn't cut off Patton. It had exposed Germany's remaining armor to destruction. Worse, it had created an opportunity the Allies were quick to exploit. Look at a map of Normandy in early August 1944. The German army formed a bulge, pushing west toward Avranches. North of them, British and Canadian forces pressed south from Caen. South of them, Patton's army was racing east and north, curving behind the German positions. The Germans were in a salient, a bulge surrounded on 3 sides. One good push could turn the salient into a pocket, with the Germans trapped inside. Montgomery, coordinating with Bradley, saw the opportunity. British and Canadian forces would attack south from Caen. Patton would curve north from Le Mans. They would meet at Falaise, closing the pocket and trapping the German army. It nearly worked. Canadian forces supported by Polish armored divisions attacked south on August 14th. Progress was slower than hoped. German resistance was fierce, and the Canadians had to fight for every yard. But they advanced. Patton's forces raced north. The 5th Armored Division reached Argenton on August 13th, just 15 miles from the Canadians driving south. The gap was closing. But then came confusion. Bradley, worried about American and Canadian forces accidentally engaging each other, ordered Patton to halt at Argenton. Patton raged at the order. 15 miles, just 15 more miles, and they'd close the trap. But he obeyed. The halt gave Germans time to escape. On August 16th, German commanders, finally recognizing their peril, began withdrawing eastward through the gap. It was a retreat that became a rout. Units abandoned their heavy equipment and fled on foot. Thousands surrendered, but tens of thousands escaped. The gap finally closed on August 21st, when Canadian and Polish forces linked up with Americans south of Falaise. But by then, much of the German army had escaped, though at a terrible cost. For those Germans trapped in the pocket, the last days were apocalyptic. Allied artillery ringed the pocket, firing into a compressed mass of German troops. Fighter bombers flew continuous sorties, bombing and strafing anything that moved. The roads became charnel houses. Dead horses, burning vehicles, abandoned equipment, and bodies. Thousands of bodies. German soldiers tried to surrender, but the sheer chaos made it difficult. Some units fought to create escape corridors. Others simply lay down their weapons and waited for capture. The lucky ones were taken prisoner. The unlucky died under artillery fire while trying to surrender. When the pocket was finally cleared, the carnage was indescribable. 10,000 Germans lay dead. 50,000 were captured. The stench of death hung over the Norman countryside for months. Even hardened combat veterans were sickened by what they saw. The German army in Western Europe had been shattered. Of the divisions that fought in Normandy, barely 20% escaped with anything resembling combat capability. The rest were destroyed or captured. The Atlantic Wall, which should have prevented invasion, had become the Germans' prison. Forced to defend forward because Hitler wouldn't authorize timely withdrawals, German forces had been fixed in place and destroyed. The wall hadn't just failed. It had contributed to Germany's defeat.
After Falaise, the war in France became a pursuit. Allied columns raced eastward, covering in days distances that had taken months to plan. Cities that should have required weeks to capture fell in hours. The German army wasn't retreating, it was disintegrating. Patton's Third Army led the pursuit. Paris, Lyon, Reims, ancient cities flashed past. French civilians, who'd endured 4 years of occupation, poured into the streets to greet their liberators. American soldiers were showered with flowers, kisses, and wine. It was liberation, and it was glorious. Paris fell on August 25th, liberated by the French 2nd Armored Division, supported by American forces. Hitler had ordered the city destroyed rather than surrendered, but the German commander, General Dietrich von Choltitz, disobeyed. Paris survived intact, its monuments and museums untouched. In southern France, the Allied landings near Caen, Operation Dragoon, launched August 15th, pushed rapidly up the Rhone Valley. German forces, already thin in the south, couldn't stop them. Lyon fell September 3rd. By mid-September, Dragoon forces linked with Patton's Third Army near Dijon. France was liberated in 6 weeks. Poland had fallen in 4. The Netherlands in 5. France, which Germany conquered in 6 weeks in 1940, was freed in roughly the same time in 1944. The difference was D-Day. The Atlantic Wall had delayed the inevitable by 4 years, but once breached, it couldn't be reconstituted. There was no second line of fortifications, no fallback position. Just Germany itself and the Rhine River. Looking back, why did Hitler's greatest fortification fail? The obvious answer is that the Atlantic Wall wasn't strong enough, but that's not quite right. Many of the fortifications were powerful and well-designed. German defenders fought skillfully.
The casualties inflicted on Allied forces, particularly at Omaha Beach, demonstrated the wall's lethal potential. The wall failed for more subtle reasons. First, it was too long and too thin. 2,000 miles of coastline couldn't be uniformly defended. Resources concentrated in one sector meant weakness elsewhere. The Germans tried to defend everywhere and ended up strong nowhere. Second, it created strategic inflexibility. Once Hitler committed to defending the Atlantic Wall forward, he couldn't easily adjust to changing circumstances. Mobile defense might have offered better options, but the wall's very existence argued against mobile defense. You don't build massive fortifications and then abandon them. Third, it was undermined by Allied deception. Operation Bodyguard didn't just mislead about invasion timing and location, it created strategic paralysis. Even after Normandy landing succeeded, Hitler kept forces at Pas de Calais for weeks, expecting the real invasion. The wall's defenders were spread thin and kept that way by brilliant deception. Fourth, it couldn't adapt to Allied innovation. The Mulberry harbors bypassed the need to capture ports. Hobart's Funnies overcame beach obstacles. Paratroopers landed behind the wall. Naval gunfire and air power negated concrete protection. Every problem the wall presented, Allied engineers had solved before the invasion. Fifth, and perhaps most critically, the wall represented defensive mentality. Germany built fortifications because it feared invasion. That fear was well-founded, but fortifications couldn't prevent invasion. They could only make it more costly. And cost, measured in casualties, was something the Allies could afford better than Germany. The Atlantic Wall was Hitler's Maginot Line, impressive, expensive, and ultimately irrelevant. Like France's fortifications in 1940, it could be bypassed, outflanked, or overwhelmed by an enemy with imagination and resources. Numbers tell only part of the story, but they matter. The Battle of Normandy, June 6 to August 25, 1944, cost the Allies roughly 226,000 casualties, including 72,000 dead. American forces suffered approximately 125,000 casualties. British and Canadian forces approximately 83,000. Other Allied nations accounted for the remainder. German casualties were far higher, roughly 450,000, including 200,000 captured. Entire divisions were destroyed. The cream of Germany's Western Army was gone. French civilian casualties are harder to quantify, but numbered at least 20,000. Dead, the bombing that preceded D-Day, the fighting that followed, and the destruction of the Falaise pocket killed thousands of French citizens. Liberation came at a terrible price for those being liberated. But numbers alone don't capture the story. Behind each statistic was a person, a young man who should have lived decades more, raised children, pursued dreams. The cost of defeating the Atlantic Wall was measured in futures that would never be realized. D-Day and the Battle of Normandy taught lessons that echo through military doctrine today. Amphibious operations require overwhelming force, detailed planning, and realistic training. The Dieppe disaster taught this lesson in 1942. D-Day applied it successfully. Deception can be as valuable as firepower. Operation Bodyguard saved thousands of lives by keeping German reserves away from Normandy. Modern military doctrine emphasizes deception as a force multiplier. Engineering and innovation can overcome apparently insurmountable obstacles. The Mulberry harbors, PLO pipeline, and Hobart's Funnies demonstrated that unconventional solutions to difficult problems can succeed brilliantly. Air superiority is essential for modern warfare. Allied control of the skies enabled the invasion, protected the beachhead, and facilitated the breakout. Without air superiority, D-Day would have failed.
Strategic inflexibility is fatal. Hitler's rigid defense of the Atlantic Wall His refusal to authorize timely withdrawals and his insistence on holding every inch of ground turned manageable situations into catastrophes. Modern doctrine emphasizes flexibility and adaptation. But perhaps the most important lesson is about human courage. D-Day succeeded ultimately because thousands of young men climbed into landing craft, crossed the channel, and ran toward fortified beaches while machine guns fired at them. All the planning, deception, and innovation meant nothing without soldiers willing to face death for a cause they believed in. The camera pans across a modern Normandy beach. Tourists walk where men died. Children play in sand once stained with blood. The bunkers remain, but now they're historical sites, not fortifications. Rust and graffiti have replaced guns and soldiers. The Atlantic Wall still exists, physically, but it exists as a monument to futility, a reminder that passive defense, no matter how massive, cannot defeat determined attack backed by superior resources and imagination. Hitler called himself the greatest builder of fortifications of all time. He might have been right about the building. The Atlantic Wall was an engineering marvel, a feat of construction that consumed unimaginable resources and labor. But building fortifications and using them effectively are different skills. The wall failed because it tried to defend everything and defended nothing well enough. It created inflexibility when adaptation was required. It couldn't stop innovative solutions like artificial harbors and specialized armor. It was undermined by brilliant Allied deception that kept German reserves dispersed. It represented defensive mentality in a war where offense held all advantages. D-Day succeeded because Allied planners learned from failures and refused to repeat mistakes. Engineers solved seemingly impossible problems with creativity and determination. Intelligence services conducted the greatest deception operation in history. Air and naval forces achieved and maintained supremacy. Ordinary soldiers displayed extraordinary courage when it mattered most. The invasion of Normandy wasn't luck. It wasn't inevitable. It was the result of years of preparation, months of detailed planning, weeks of deception, and hours of courage on beaches where everything could have gone wrong. Yes, things went wrong. Paratroopers scattered. Bombers hit American troops. Omaha Beach nearly failed. The weather almost forced cancellation. But the operation succeeded because the Allies had planned for things to go wrong and had built redundancy into every level of the operation. The Atlantic Wall, for all its concrete and steel, had no redundancy. It relied on preventing Allied landings. When the landings succeeded, the wall had no backup plan. German forces fought skillfully and bravely, but they fought a losing battle from June 6th onward. By August 25th, France was liberated. By September, Allied forces approached Germany's borders. The war would continue for another 8 months, but the outcome was decided. Germany would lose. And it started on a beach in Normandy, where the greatest fortification in history was breached by men who refused to accept that it was impassable. In the aftermath of World War II, Allied intelligence officers interviewed German commanders about the Atlantic Wall's failure. Field Marshal von Rundstedt, the man who commanded the wall's defense, summed it up with characteristic bluntness. The best thing about the Atlantic Wall was that it never existed, except in Hitler's imagination and Allied intelligence reports. He was right. The wall was more propaganda than reality, more perception than substance. It looked impressive in photographs and speeches, but when tested, it failed. The lesson endures. Fortifications alone cannot win wars. They cannot replace strategy, flexibility, and the will to fight. They can delay defeat, but cannot prevent it when facing a determined enemy with superior resources and imagination. The Atlantic Wall failed because it was designed to be impregnable, and nothing human-made is truly impregnable. Somewhere, someone will find a way through, over, under, or around. The Allies found all 4 ways, and when they did, Hitler's greatest fortification became his greatest liability. The concrete remains, slowly eroding under decades of salt air and weather. But the true memorial to D-Day isn't concrete. It's the freedom that victory purchased. Thousands of men died on Normandy's beaches so that millions could live free. Their sacrifice breached more than a wall of concrete. It breached the walls of tyranny and oppression. That's why D-Day matters. That's why we remember, not because a wall failed, but because courage succeeded. Today, 79 years after D-Day, the Atlantic Wall's remnants serve as museums and memorials. The bunkers on Omaha Beach, which witnessed such carnage, now offer visitors a glimpse into history. The artificial Mulberry harbor at Arromanches, portions of which remain visible at low tide, testifies to Allied ingenuity.
The men who stormed those beaches are mostly gone now. The youngest D-Day veterans are in their late 90s. Soon, there will be no living witnesses to tell the story firsthand. But the story remains, preserved in documents, photographs, and memory. It's a story of how planning defeated concrete, innovation conquered fear, and courage changed the world. It's the story of why Hitler's greatest fortification failed and why freedom prevailed. We remember so that future generations will understand. Liberty is never free. Tyranny can be defeated. And sometimes history turns on a beach where ordinary people do extraordinary things.